Basically, that's really what it boils down to is you probably, yes, you feel this emotion or this feeling, I hate, and fill in the blank, fill in the 4-letter code of whatever type you have or person you have or whatever. I'm just saying you probably have a reason, and I bet it's not the real reason. I bet it's a lot deeper than that, or it's multiple reasons that you may not have looked at. But it's not just, oh, I hate this person because of a 4-letter code. Just pick any one of the 16.
Right.
It's like, it's a bunch of other stuff that you've mapped onto that 4-letter code. It could be context. It could be circumstance, timeline, whatever it is. Validate the emotion is real. Yes, you feel this way. Why should not necessarily be validated. You may be completely wildly off. Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So I want you, as you're listening or watching right now, to imagine that person in your life. Now, maybe they're not intimate with you, close to you, but they're in your life. And they're such a challenging person. I want you to imagine this. You could almost, if you were this type of person, apply the label of, oh, I really hate how this person makes me feel. The word hate would come up. Maybe you don't hate them as a person, but you certainly hate your interactions with them, and you hate the experience of being around them, and you hate having to deal with them. Maybe hate's the strongest word I could probably use.
Well, you already said it in a nice way. I hate how they make me feel is like a nice way of saying it.
That's
most
true.
people just go ahead and take the leap and go, I hate that person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but I do want to give accommodation because, like, I'm thinking, like, who do I hate? I don't think I hate anybody, but I certainly hate being around certain people, right? I hate the way they make me feel or the way they make the interactions. It's not fun to be around them. So I wouldn't say I hate that person, but I certainly hate engaging with them. So let's start with that. Let's talk about you as you're listening or watching. There's people in your life, and there's probably multiple people. It's just such a lift. It's such an annoyance. It's so difficult to relate to certain people. Now, these might be people, your family or extended family. I mean, we've used the silly joke about Uncle Bob at Thanksgiving or the Christmas holiday dinner. You have a family gathering, and Uncle Bob is a stand-in for that one family member that always talks about stuff that's just not polite conversation, right? They're bringing up politics and religion, or they're trying to start things with people, or they just don't have the right end of stuff. They're causing drama. And it's like, man, I don't get along with that Uncle Bob character in my family, whoever that might be for you listening or watching. But maybe it's a coworker. I think often we have situations where coworkers or roommates, maybe we didn't choose or we did choose, we fell out of favor with. We have to be around these people all the time. They're not really family, but they're like people in our lives, and they frustrate us. We hate the interactions with them. There's really no way out. We have to interact with them, right? We can't really just remove ourselves from the situation.
I think there's a demographic that usually falls in people's hate bucket.
Yeah.
X's. I think usually X's are the people that
typically.
Yeah. Or your partner's ex.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's a person who I think some people give themselves total permission to hate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, you know, when you have somebody, and I guess an ex, depending on the situation, if you have kids together, you can't really get away from them often.
Yeah.
If you don't have a life that you've built together that you still are both part of, maybe there's a way to kind of get some distance. But sometimes you have to be in an ex's life, right? A romantic ex's life for the long haul. So that can be tough too. So we're talking about people in your life, and we're going to use, again, a strong word, hate. But what we really mean by this is a person that you just don't get along with. And Antonia, do you have any of these people in your life that you think about? When I think about, like, again, I don't have anybody I hate, but I don't necessarily enjoy our interactions.
Yeah, I think it's not nice to say that I hate somebody or I hate a person. I think the nice way of saying it is that I hate how that person makes me feel. But I think there's a couple people that, you know, I mean, I think when I try to define the word hate, it usually comes down to being okay if that person didn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, what's the Stewie quote from Family Guy? I don't want to kill them. I just don't want them to be alive anymore. And I would say that there are certain people that I can think of that I would put in the category of, like, I don't want to kill them. I just would be okay if they didn't exist anymore.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there a pattern to personality type of the people we have difficulty with? That's a big meta question I have today, because I think as you're listening or watching right now, you're like, oh, my boss is fill in the blank. Let's pick any random type. And so that's how those types show up. And so I have a difficult time with that personality type.
Well, and that's the subject that we're going to land on today, or like we're going to highlight, which is what happens when you hate a personality type.
That's right.
And I'm glad that you started it with people, individuals that we hate, or we hate how they make us feel, if we're going to say it in the diplomatic way. But there's a real, I think there's an insight into understanding that when we're talking about personality types, we're actually not talking about, we're not in the practical talking about types. We're talking about people who have type preferences.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good thing to start out with going like, are there people in your life that you hate? And then maybe even reverse engineer why you might have animosity towards a certain personality type. And I'll hearken to mine, which if you've listened to the Personality Hacker podcast for any length of time, actually not. No, like if you were one of the early listeners, actually, I don't think I've said this in a long time, but if you were one of the early listeners that listened like the first 5 years, I would say, you probably heard me talk about ISTJs, because I kind of had a chip on my shoulder a little bit, since I felt like the ISTJs were the type that seemed to dislike me the most. And so I had this image in my head that if I realized a person was an ISTJ, I just assumed they disliked me. And I wouldn't pour any energy at all into a dynamic with somebody who I suspected had ISTJ preferences. I just wouldn't, like, I just assumed it was doomed to failure.
And wait, this is not because you have a difficulty. You just assume they're rejecting you wholesale.
Yeah, but of course, when people reject you, you tend to not like them very much.
Of course.
So if you believe that, then it oftentimes goes both ways.
But it wasn't like a thing where you're like, man, I wish ISTJs were more forthcoming. I just can't be around this type because they're not forthcoming enough. Or I just wish ISTJs were better with information, or they were better at getting things done, or whatever, fill in the blank of whatever it is. It's more like, I wish ISTJs didn't reject me, or I didn't believe they rejected me.
And it might have even actually started earlier than that, with me not believing that I didn't like ISTJs, and then finding examples of ones that didn't like me in order to justify the bias. That's probably the most likely scenario. It wasn't just like, hey, how come all these people that are like this don't like me? It's more likely that most likely that I had the bias to begin with from certain interactions, and then carried that bias into the next interactions. And then lo and behold, those people didn't like me very much, surprisingly, probably because I was, not giving very much in the interactions. And then of course it snowballs and becomes more and more and more.
Yeah.
And so it most likely started with me. And all those examples are really funny, because ISTJs are actually usually good at all those things.
That's why I said them.
Yeah, right.
To make sure it wasn't like I'm trying to land the plane on something.
Not a real thing. Yeah. And so what's interesting is that to fast forward to now, I guess the point is to fast forward to now. And I don't mean to say this in that old cliche way, but like ISTJs are some of my best friends, right? Some of my best friends are ISTJs. There's something that struck me at your last family reunion, and that was not that long ago at the time of this recording, that my favorite person to go find and have a conversation with is your Uncle Ralph.
Yeah.
Like whenever I'm bored at a family reunion, or whenever I'm like, okay, I guess I've done my requisite catch-ups with everyone, who am I going to go talk to? And I find myself going and finding Uncle Ralph. Uncle Ralph undoubtedly has ISTJ preferences. And I'll sit down next to Uncle Ralph, and he and I will talk about all sorts of things, right? We'll talk about generational theory, and we'll talk about political things.
American nations.
We'll talk about American nations. And also we share so many different interests that I find it fascinating that I'm always looking for Uncle Ralph.
Yeah.
That is a total difference from what I would have believed about myself 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And then I noticed the same thing with your Aunt Chris on your mom's side. So Uncle Ralph is your father's brother. Aunt Chris is your mother's sister. And Aunt Chris, again, most likely has ISTJ preferences. And I'm always looking for Aunt Chris, right? Where's Aunt Chris? I want to go talk to Aunt Chris because she's fabulous. So I found that this personality type that would have been in my list of like what's the one personality type you don't get along with in times past, when everything was still a little more theoretical, I would have said ISTJs. And at this point, I can't say that because it's just not true. There are plenty of ISTJs who I love dearly, and not just love them through familiarity, but like am legitimately fond of and will seek out over people of other types.
Yeah. So 2 things I want to mention. You've actually come up with this phrase, Antonia. I think it's brilliant. You say, and we can unpack it in a moment because I got 2 things I want to say, but every complaint about a personality type is actually a complaint about one person.
Right.
That is that type.
Yeah.
right? And that's usually what we tend to do. And the reason I say that is for the second thing I want to say, mine was ISFP. I have a very challenging person in my life that I had ISFP has ISFP preferences. They're still in my life. And I remember, I still do this. I will go through the world projecting the negative qualities of this one person onto every ISFP I meet. Like unconsciously, like I've gotten a hold of it, but and then I will ignore and not register the positive things that aren't like the person I've modeled. So anytime I see a behavior that's even close to what I'm expecting that's negative, I'm like, aha, yep, ISFPs, I see it. Check another mark, see what they're like. But any information that conflicts with that, that's positive or it's a good trait that maybe this person that I modeled doesn't have, I immediately don't accept it. I'm like, well, that's probably a one-off, or I might not see it. Like I don't let myself register it, or I don't really own it. I don't take it in. I don't put that into the composite map of the ISFP personality type as much. Now, I'm being a little hyperbolic. I've done a lot of work to try to do that because I do this for a living. So I'm trying to do that. But I will say that it takes a lot of effort. And if it wasn't my job to talk about personality types and to talk about personal growth and to apply these things all the time, I could see myself going through the world for years, dismissing and projecting bad things onto every ISFP I meet.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so, yeah. And so I think we're all doing this and we got to figure out, okay, how do we stop doing this if we have a quote type we hate? Again, it's probably a person that's caused us challenge that we're projecting onto other people. First of all, we may not even be right about their type, the other person, but let's say we are, they're not the same person that caused the trauma or was our difficult personality that we dealt with. There's a lot of ways these types can show up.
Yeah, I think if I hadn't made this my career as well, my profession, I have a feeling that I would probably still be assuming that I don't like ISTJs and they don't like me. Yeah. I would still be assuming, because I wouldn't be reevaluating why would I reevaluate it, right? Like the only reason why I've had to reevaluate it is because I have clients of literally every personality type. Yes. And so I have to go into client sessions, coaching, events. I have to go in being unbiased about everybody who's shown up. And so it's forced me to see it's forced me to see all the good traits of literally every single personality type.
I think the other key here too is that when we go through the world like that, we also have the mere opposite. So for example, I've had an awareness that not all INFJs are as pure as the wind-driven snow in their character, in their intention, in their, offering of magnanimous energy to the humanity, to humanity writ large. That's been hard won. Like I would just go through, my mom has ISFJ preferences and she's a wonderful person. And I just project onto every INFJ I meet the character qualities that I grew up with. And some of the negative stuff too, but they're all from my mom and they're wonderful. And so INFJs, they struggle with some of these things, but they, look at all the positives they bring every time. And so when an INFJ doesn't behave like I expect them to, well, now I'm mad at them. Now I do kind of like, I don't enjoy that interaction. You're not a proper INFJ. Like you're doing this wrong. But it's because even the positive ways we see type can be what we project onto other types. So again, all of my celebrations of a type are actually celebrations of one person.
Yes.
To go back to your original phrase of our challenges with that type.
Yes, that is a very good point, that if we are going to demonize a type based on a single individual we're projecting onto the world, we're going to do the opposite too. We're going to pedestal a certain personality types. And that's very common. People pedestaling certain types. I mean, I don't know how many people I've met that pedestal INTJs. I mean, it's like every time they run into an INTJ, they're like, oh, I have to, I feel so dumb in comparison. And I'm just like, well, the INTJs may or may not be seeing it that way, but there are quite a few INTJs. I'm like, yeah, you don't worry about it. Like, that's not a thing for that INTJ. That's you're not going to have to worry about it. You're probably at their level. Yeah. So, but there's this idea of like, how they've been painted as masterminds and chess, playing the 5D chess in life. And so there's a certain reputation that certain types get. And I probably, with my ISTJ bias, was running into, reputation issues as well. ISTJs do not have the same reputation that, say, INTJs do. So I want to go back to before you talked about flipping the script on the positive side, which I think is totally relevant as well. I want to go back to this idea that you said you might not have their type right. I think one of the challenges in coming like just having this prejudgment of disliking a certain personality type, it means that if somebody shares those type preferences but doesn't share the negative characteristics that you're used to seeing, you might be in danger of mistyping them, meaning that all of the examples, all the good examples of this personality type are ones that are being edited out of your mind.
Yeah.
You kind of touched on that before too. And so if you're editing out all of the positive examples of people who share this type preference, then of course it's only ever going to, reinforce this idea that this type is terrible, because when they're not terrible, they're not, in your mind, they can't be that type.
Yes.
And so I can't even imagine how many ISTJs growing up were wonderful human beings that I interacted with and were good friends with that I didn't recognize as people with ISTJ preferences, because I probably thought that they were maybe ISFJs or INTJs or some type that I got along with better in my own mind.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the challenges. And if we're not just gonna, I think we should probably talk about not just types you hate and acknowledging that we probably have some bias, but what to do about it.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, like what am I supposed to do if I do have a type I hate? Do I just go through the world hoping I don't have to engage and interact and walk way around them, or try to force them to be better people? Or how do I manage this? What am I supposed to do about it?
So I think one of the things that I can say here to address the first thing you said, because we do need to talk about how to get a hold of the types we hate, or what to do about that. I would just say that getting a mistype or a misread on someone's personality because we have conflated behaviors that were negative that we knew were associated with a type, and now we project those behaviors onto other types. I mean, this is a classic thing that we do a lot of work around with our profile training students, for example. Get away from behavior. Yes, behavior is an indicator. It's the starting place, but we're trying to get to cognition, like the subjective way the person sees the world, their worldview, and makes decisions for themselves. That's what it's about. And everybody makes decisions about subject matter based on their life experiences. They're going to maybe use the same cognitive process if they're the similar type or same type. So all ETJs will make their best decisions using the criteria of extroverted thinking, or what we call effectiveness, right? What works, what bears out as the result. But how every ETJ does that is going to be a little bit different, even though that's the criteria they're using. Their life circumstance, their age, their background, their career training. That's what we tell our students to really watch for, is you can't just say, oh, behavior A equals type over here, type A. But that's not a one-to-one. These behaviors are indicators. So when you see a behavior that you've associated, start to loosen that a little bit. I think that's really what the first point you're trying to say, Antonia, is don't have one-to-one correlation between one type of behavior, especially negative behaviors, and a personality type trait, or a personality type cognition showing up. That's a bad conflation to make. And you're going to make a lot of misreads, and you're going to project a lot of negativity onto people if you do that. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's why whenever I read comments or hear people say things like an INFJ would never ... or an ENTJ would never ... I'm like, all people are capable of all actions.
Yeah.
So it's not what they're doing, it's why they're doing what they're doing.
Yes.
And what direction they're coming at it from. And so I think that's a really good point to remember, that type is not action or behavior.
Yeah.
It's cognitive.
I've noticed that there are, to kind of validate the person that's watching or listening right now, that there's probably people in their life, because we're like hippies here talking about everybody should love each other and it's all going to be fine. And don't say you hate a person, say you hate how they make you feel. It's like, no, there's times we just register for the self. Like, I just hate that person. I can't stand them, right? We talked about why that might be and projecting a type, but I just want to speak to that for a moment to say that those feelings are very real and visceral, right? When we have somebody we have a challenge with, and I've noticed too that people we have challenges with, sometimes we do what we say, we project, but somebody will say, I have a challenge with ENTJs. And then I'll notice they actually do. Every ENTJ in their life, they're not getting along with. I'm going, well, is it ENTJs or is it you that you have an issue with, right? If it's every person has an issue with you, maybe you're the problem, right? Or something like that. That's the first thing I think in terms of. But I have noticed this pattern that somebody that has an issue with somebody, they seem to have this issue across their life. I don't know if it's imago work. I don't know what's going on there, but it seems to follow them around. They seem to have a challenge and they kind of quote unquote hate this type, and that type keeps showing up again and again and again in their life to give them the opportunity to hate them.
Yeah.
Right? You see what I'm saying? Like I don't know if the person would couch it as hate or if they'd say, yeah, I hate that person or that type, but certainly they have issue. It seems like every single time that shows up.
Yeah. Well, so what I'm hearing you say is that sometimes a person feels that way and it's valid because every example or it seems like they attract not a great example of the people with these type preferences in their life over and over again.
Or the context you're in too.
It could be the context.
If I was to work in a preschool environment with 5 other ESFJs, me as an ENFP, with 5 ESFJs, I bet you I'd start getting a complex around ESFJs. Because in that context, everything's going to make sense to the 5 ESFJs in that context.
Right.
Specifically. And it's not going to make sense to me in the same way.
Well, and all the weird things you're going to want to add to your class. And
It's going to be like, and we're going to be like oil and water in that environment. It's not going to be okay. I'm probably going to start hating ESFJs if I'm in the environment. They're probably going to start hating ENFPs if we're in that environment. Right. All 5 of them are like, that guy's an ENFP. I hate ENFPs. Like, take us and put us in a different context now. Let's say we're all working at a church in a volunteer movement to like serve like food to people that are in need. And it's not just 5 ESFJs, but it's like a bunch of other types. And we're all like on this food service line and we're all working together to do that. And they're not in charge of it. And they're not working with kids. We're working with adults and we're in a completely different environment. Different dynamics would come out.
Right.
I probably wouldn't develop a problem with ESFJs and they probably wouldn't develop a problem with me. Maybe they would, but probably not.
Yeah. You'd probably find yourself talking a lot and chatting each other up and creating like a fun environment for this volunteerism and all that.
But to my earlier point, like if you hate a type and you seem to find them everywhere you go, well, I bet it's either you, but it also could be the context you're in.
Right.
If I'm in early childhood education and I've chosen that as my profession, as an example, I'm probably going to be around SFJs and STJs a lot because a lot of them end up in early childhood education. It's not a rule, but it's a trend. It attracts them. Or real estate. I've noticed that SJs are attracted to real estate. So if I'm in real estate, I probably am going to be around a lot of SJs that have certain behaviors in concert with each other, similar behaviors, because that attracted them. And I'm going to start to develop like, I don't like these people, potentially. I mean, I'm just picking on this one type, right? Or this one grouping for the sake of argument.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying though?
Yeah. So I'm hearing a little bit of there's a little validation here.
Yeah.
Meaning that I mean, if you think I said, or you quoted me saying, if you hate a personality type, you actually hate one person.
Yeah.
But depending upon the context you find yourself in, it could be that you actually hate this environment or you hate all the people, like how a person matches to an environment. And so it's actually not the personality type you hate the personality type in this context, and the context tends to draw a lot of this type. And so in that kind of situation, it might feel like it's not just one person. It might feel like it's everybody of this type. And then you also mentioned the concept of imago. So you said it could be you, like you and I actually think it's always us. So I think that's probably where we're going to head is like, okay, well, we can't change everybody else, but we can change ourselves. And so there might be better ways for us as individuals to deal with people that we build this kind of picture in our head around.
Yeah.
But it might be that we have, like you mentioned, an imago. We did a whole podcast episode on imago relationships, but what an imago is, like the easiest way to describe it is an imago relationship is a relationship that you are unconsciously recreating over and over and over again until you learn a lesson from it. So it could be that a personality type is associated with your imago. And so you're not only unconsciously seeking this personality type out, but you're unconsciously seeking an unhealthy dynamic with them.
Yes.
And so that could also be what's going on.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm validating the feeling of hate.
Mm-hmm.
You may not know why.
Right.
But basically, that's really what it boils down to is you probably, you feel this emotion or this feeling, I hate, and fill in the blank, fill in the 4-letter code of whatever type you have or person you have or whatever. I'm just saying you probably have a reason, and I bet it's not the real reason. I bet it's a lot deeper than that, or it's multiple reasons that you may not have looked at. But it's not just, I hate this person because of a 4-letter code. Just pick any one of the 16.
Right.
It's a bunch of other stuff that you've mapped onto that 4-letter code. It could be context. It could be circumstance, timeline, whatever it is. Validate the emotion is real. Yes, you feel this way. why should not necessarily be validated. You may be completely wildly off.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to create the distinction around.
That is a very good reminder, introverted
Right?
feeling parent, is to validate the emotion,
Yep.
recognize that like, yeah, it's a real emotion and you feel it for real reasons. And those reasons might actually be different than what
Yes.
you expect.
Okay. So we've already talked about be careful that you don't conflate behavior with cognition. That's going to skew things.
Or type.
Your complaints about a type are probably your complaints about one person.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you might feel hatred toward a particular personality type, but you probably don't really know why. There's probably a bunch of factors going, and you've just patterned it that this is this 4-letter code that you hate, when it's actually behaviors you hate that have been associated with the 4-letter code.
Right.
So with those 3 things in place, that's the first building blocks. What can we do about this? How do we think about this? How do we move through the world? What are some actionable things that we can take away? True learning equals behavior change. If we want to learn about this and change our behavior, what avenues do we have available to us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned before, I feel like it's important to remember that we can't actually change anybody else. We can only change ourselves or change our behavior.
Yeah.
And so it's always an inside job. And when it comes to quote unquote trying to get over hating a personality type, it means that's going to be an inside job too. It's going to be about more sort of changing our perspective or changing our how we deal with these things, or maybe getting some clarity that will help us dance a different dance, right? Like there's a certain choreography that I found myself naturally engaging with everybody who I thought had ISTJ preferences. And so that was, it wasn't just on the other person and how they were treating me. It was on me and how I was treating them. And I was probably triggering a bunch of things inside of them, maybe even intentionally, right? Unconsciously, but intentionally, sort of poking the bear and pushing buttons, and then getting the, predictable response, right? Getting the response I was expecting, and then reinforcing the bias that I carried in with me, and thus making every interaction more and more and more cementing this idea. So I think the first thing we have to remember is that once the bias is created, it's now being carried into every interaction. And it's not simply a matter of waiting for somebody to, encourage us to reevaluate these prejudices and preconceptions. Because if we're setting them and ourselves up to fail in these interactions, what's the lift we're requiring for them to get us to think differently about their type? Like we're asking too much. We're asking them to overcome our prejudices and be so amazing as an example of a human being that not only will they make up for everybody else's past, bad deeds of the past that share their preferences, but they'll also do it despite our either conscious or unconscious animosity.
Yeah.
And that's just not fair, right? And they're probably not going to do that. And so we have to remember that we're carrying our biases in. And if we can remember that, then we can reevaluate our behavior. We can watch ourselves set these dynamics up, and maybe be less provocative, be less putting them in a position where they will evidence all the worst traits that we expect them to.
So what I hear you saying then is sometimes when we enter an interaction with somebody of a certain type, we're bringing behaviors that will trigger in them the behaviors we dislike.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can look at ourselves to go, am I doing something unconscious or conscious, as you admitted for yourself? Maybe not super overt, but certainly you kind of know what's happening maybe?
I called them unconscious, but intentional.
Intentional,
so
but
I don't think I did. I don't think I was aware of it, but I think it was still intentional behavior.
Fair enough. So we're doing these things and then we're getting the response. And we're, aha, see, this is why I dislike this person, even though maybe we provoked it.
Yes, exactly. And I think for me, I probably was bringing out my weirdest parts because I was dealing with what I thought was rejection of weird parts, right? Like my extroverted intuition, especially when I was younger. I'm a way more chill ENTP now. When I was younger, I say it on a regular basis, but I'm not kidding when I say I was a bit of a dick when I was younger. I was way more the ENTP stereotype.
Yeah.
The person who was constantly trying to get everybody to debate with me. And now Now I hate the stereotype, so I push back against it. And I'm like, I'm not that kind of person. But if I think about how I showed up when I was younger, I was a lot closer to, sort of the prototypical version. I was also somebody who had not a lot of respect for feelings. And so believed everything was fair game when it came to jokes. So I would joke with people in not a very respectful way. And then if they got offended, of course, then I got my back bowed and I was like, that's their problem.
Were you the ENTP people hated?
Probably.
I hate ENTPs because of her.
Yeah, probably actually. I mean, I was also a bit of a life of a party, if you can believe it. And so I think people liked me theoretically, but not personally, which is
like a TV character.
Like a TV character.
Like a TI TV character.
That's right.
Dr. House.
That's right. Yeah, not that I necessarily think Dr. House was an ENTP.
Agreed.
But that said, it doesn't matter, right? So yes, I was more liked in theory than in practice. So there was probably a fair bit of, being my weirdest extroverted intuition self when I was around people with ISTJ preferences, thus bringing out the most uncertain part of them, now I realize, and them like not knowing what to do about that. And so maybe it wasn't really a rejection of me. It was more uncertainty within them. I understand that now at like the ripe old age that I'm at this point, understanding type as I do. But I didn't know that at the time. And so I was very provocative. And so, but not in the good way. And so it's important to remember that we might be setting these situations and circumstances up. We actually might be causing the thing we dislike unconsciously, but intentionally. And so for me, it was like, oh, I didn't want to be rejected for my weirdness, and I was being rejected for my weirdness in my mind. And so I was like, well, you can't stop me. So I was going to be even more weird and even more rejected. Mm-hmm. So if we can watch ourselves in these interactions, and you might, a person listening might have an autoresponder that says, it's not me, I'm not doing anything, but we're doing something. We're doing something. And it might be doing nothing. Like, how many people do I know that get frustrated when somebody doesn't carry their side of the conversation and puts all of the social pressure on the extrovert to carry the entire conversation, have to figure out what to talk about next, right? And then that person that isn't chatty is going, I didn't do anything. Like, they literally didn't do anything. They just sat there. And that all by itself can be a problem to a person who believes that they now have the social strain of carrying the entire conversation for the other person. Yeah. So whether you're doing or not doing something, are you creating a challenge for the other person in that dynamic because you're bringing those biases in? So that's the first thing. So basically, just to land the plane on that, we need to check in with ourselves. What energy are we bringing to an interaction that's causing this person to behave the way that makes me hate them? I'm hating somebody or hating a type. Maybe it's a pattern. What am I doing around that type? Is there anything I'm doing? That's a first safety check. Like, is there something I'm doing that's causing this to happen that makes me hate this? Yep. So that's the first step. The second thing I would say is to be aware of what they're doing that is actually reflecting the worst parts of you back to yourself. So mirroring, triggering. That's right. Exactly. And so this person might be actually creating some discomfort in the self that doesn't feel like you, because they're usually a different enough personality type to other them, right? Like, that's not me, that's the other. And yet they might be reflecting things back to us, which are our worst characteristics and traits, but not their worst characteristics and traits. It might actually be strengths for them, but we don't like it. Yes. So take, for example, if a person is particularly good at building career capital, but we're not, and we've decided that that's all stupid and people who are super into their careers are big dummies, and we run into somebody who has a lot of ambition and drive in the career, we might other them and go, well, that's bad and wrong, and project poor character onto them or badness or whatever, not realizing that what they've triggered inside of us is we actually haven't contended with the part of ourselves that doesn't like that we're not good at that thing ourselves and has decided to reject it as opposed to making peace with it. Yeah. So that's the other piece is this person of this personality type, or this individual of this personality type, projecting, or not projecting, but reflecting back to us things that we have not, that like basically is unprocessed material inside of us.
Yeah. So this is mostly shadow content.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about when we talk about the shadow with our clients on the episodes we've recorded about this, one of the ways you know you're in shadow material is if you get triggered, if something kicks up for you in relation to somebody else, there's an opportunity you have there to go, does this reflect something about me that I'm unwilling to accept? And so again, I think of a person, let's say you have a really challenging boss, and not just your boss of that type, but there's also another person maybe in your school that's that type, and another person that's in your family that's that type. And you're like, man, I've got a problem with all this. So after you've checked, am I bringing some energy that's causing this to happen? You can ask yourself, is this person reflecting something in me I'm unwilling to see or accept in myself? Are they triggering me in a way unconsciously to go and try to push this away? And so I have to push this personality type away because it seems to represent this to me every time I engage with it.
Yeah. And I would be cautious for a person listening to not conflate what you just said, that this is shadow material with shadow functions.
Correct.
Like we can have shadow material that isn't material necessarily in a specific function.
Yes.
Shadow material just means things we're unconscious of or unaware of inside of ourselves.
Yes.
So if the person whose personality type you dislike isn't somebody who has your functions as their shadow functions or vice versa, it doesn't matter. It could be somebody who has almost identical function preferences to you, but they're still kicking off shadow material for you. So because they figured something out that you didn't, or they're, evidencing something that's still unprocessed inside of you. So yes, that's the second thing, is make sure that you're not just being triggered by them. Because then once you go and deal with that trigger, go handle the unprocessed material and make peace with it and integrate it, suddenly that personality type doesn't have the power to trigger you anymore. And now you don't hate them anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So those are good 2 things. Anything else you have on the list?
On my list of how-tos that I'm making up as we go. Well, one of the things you mentioned was...
I saw you taking notes.
I'm taking notes right here.
Just making
Yeah.
You've been made it up like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, that's right. Well, as we've been talking about them, I've been jotting them down. But just when you mentioned being in an elementary school with maybe, say, in that particular context, a disproportionately high number of ESFJs.
Yeah.
I was thinking it's really easy for us to not just demonize a personality type, but if we know enough about type to, say, be familiar with cognitive functions, we can do the same thing to a function as we're doing to a type.
Yeah.
We can say things like, I hate extroverted feeling, or I hate extroverted thinking. In the CAR model, we call those harmony and effectiveness. So extroverted feeling or harmony, I know a lot of people who complain about the function. I know a lot of people who complain about extroverted thinking or effectiveness.
No matter where it is in somebody's personality type.
That's right.
There's an issue with the function wholesale.
That's right. Exactly. Or I dislike introverted sensing or memory. It's like we can have an issue with just that. And suddenly now we hate everybody that's a representative of that function, which is actually quite a few personality types now.
Yes. And in our personality life path mentorship, as we go through 8 weeks and we look at each of the functions, I've noticed that I can't say almost always. I can't say always, but I can say almost always. It's definitely reflecting back something in us that we don't like that functions, our relationship to that part of reality and our own lives. It's almost always that. Mm-hmm. Like anytime somebody has an issue with a function or its energy, it's something that's massively missing in your own life.
Yes.
Or is out of whack or something's off with it.
Yeah. Or you have unprocessed material in it.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's common for us to take issue with a specific function just as easily as it is for us to take issue with a specific type.
Yeah.
And so if either thing is happening, whether it's a specific personality type or a specific function, the antidote, I think, is the same, which is to find examples of how that type and that function are not only great, but why they're necessary. Like why does somebody with ISTJ preferences need to exist? Why do ISTJs need to exist? And me ruminating on that and thinking about it and looking for all of the positive examples of ISTJs and how much they've brought to the world and the talents that they have, particularly the ones that I do not share, has given me profound respect for people of that type.
Yeah.
I've noticed that some of my favorite interior designers, and we actually ended up having somebody who is an interior designer who has ISTJ preferences in our personal life path program,
and
Antonia.
PT and profiler training.
And profiler training.
In fact, that's where she came through.
That's right. I've noticed that they have some of my favorite aesthetics.
Yeah.
I just love a nice, clean, but just like that little pop of individualism from their introverted feeling authenticity, tertiary 10-year-old. I love their design aesthetic.
Functional.
That's
it
right.
works.
That's right.
It's not overdone to where it's impractical. It's got all the blending. Yeah,
but it's comfortable. Has that homey introverted sensing memory piece. It's like it's just right.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the many different ways that an ISTJ can show up contributing, like interior design, management,
leadership.
Just, people in politics, people at, it doesn't matter, right? There's all sorts of examples I can think of ISTJs who are doing it well and doing it right and filling niches and roles in a very unique way that only they can. So if you can find ways to really admire and understand the necessity of that type, then you can start to thaw, right? And a big piece of this is like removing our bias, not coming in with an assumption and then manifesting the assumption. Part of the way that we remove that assumption is by questioning our premises.
Yeah.
I needed to question the premise around people of this type. And when I started questioning the premise, I discovered, I was wrong. Actually, my premise was flawed.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I was having this experience.
So we're talking about the difference between perception and perspective here, where your personal perception of a personality type you quote unquote hate or is a challenge for you. I think what you're talking about, Antonia, is going meta a little bit, getting outside of yourself, rise above the entire system. Why are all 16 personality types needed? What does each type bring to the world? And you could also extend this into cognitive functions. There's 8 functions. You could say, what do the 8 functions bring to the world? We did a whole series on all 8 functions at one point on this podcast. Why the world needs introverted thinking or accuracy. Why the world needs, extroverted feeling or harmony. We talked about all of those because we think it's important for us to understand the need and what these things give us. And when they're blended together, what the individual personality types give us. So first is make sure I'm checking in. What energy am I bringing to these interactions with the person I quote unquote hate? Am I causing some of it? Like, am I bringing anything to the table? That's a quick check. This one here we just talked about was ensure, my brain just went blank all of a sudden. What were the other two? The second one was
triggers.
Triggers,
they're
that's
not,
right.
Make sure they're not triggering something.
Shadow material.
That's right. That's in your shadow. And that's why you dislike them.
And then this one here is go meta on it and really see from a perspective of here's multiple reasons why all of these types in a larger ecosystem, not just my experience. Yeah, it's easy for me and my single viewpoint to hate a person or hate a type, but not everybody's going to hate that type. That's me. So what does this mean in the broader scope of things? What can I look for and see gratitude and understanding of why this is necessary in the world, even if I have a challenge with it?
Yep.
That's the third thing.
Exactly. And I think another helpful perspective to take is that it kind of makes me think of, and I quoted this before, and I think this quote has become pretty popular over the last 15 years. The beginning line to Anna Karenina, where he says that all happy families are the same and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. All healthy people and personality types are kind of the same, right? When you're healthy, you come across pretty chill, self-confident, don't get easily triggered, aren't looking for a fight, right?
I just had an intuition why our culture is so addicted to labels of trauma and suffering, because it's a way to distinguish ourselves in a world that is so homogenized, to create a unique selling proposition for me as who I am in the world, an individuality. Well, the more labels I can put onto myself that coordinate me into all these things that are quote unquote issues with me or specialnesses of me or whatever, that's a way to make it so that I'm not just part of the homogenized happy families.
Yeah.
Right. I can be unique if I'm broken and I've got troubles.
Yeah.
But I'm homogenized if I'm okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting
I just thought that's probably a pretty good reason why we've got addicted to this as a culture.
I'm going to take it into consideration as a node in the system. I think that might be a node, of creating distinctions. But that's a bit of a segue.
It is.
So
it just came up. I thought I'd record it to capture the thought.
Fair enough. In the future, if we ever listen back to our own podcast, we'll be like, oh, that's when I had that thought. All right. So to go back to the concept, though, the original point of entry was the happy families are the same and unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And I would say that carries over to type. When we are healthy as a personality type, we're going to share a lot of characteristics. I think I was like kind of going through a list of them, like that we're going to be more centered. We're going to have the sort of that central nervous system that isn't, sort of humming at this like super high sort of intense energy that gets everybody else to hum at that high energy. Usually a healthy person has a more calm, centered central nervous system. Their soma is a little more relaxed. They have a contagious relaxedness about them. And everybody's insecure. It doesn't matter how healthy you are. You're still going to have some insecurities, but you're not like constantly overcompensating for them and introducing a bunch of coping mechanisms that everybody else has to play along with in order for you to be okay. Like healthy people all kind of share sort of that more grounded energy.
Yeah.
Unhealthy people, though, are unhealthy in their own way. And I would say that this includes personality types. A person with ESTJ preferences that's unhealthy is going to look very different than a person of INFJ preferences that's unhealthy. And a person of ISFP preferences that's unhealthy is going to look very different than an ENTP that is unhealthy. We're all going to be unhealthy in our own way. And so oftentimes I suspect that when we dislike a personality type, we have had the misfortune perhaps to run into unhealthy versions of them. And it's the unhealthy version that we really can't stand. Like I can handle an unhealthy ENFP. I can handle one. They're similar enough to me that I kind of get it. I've been unhealthy in my past. I sort of understand and vibe with them. I can calm them down. Like I don't have a problem with ENFPs that are unhealthy. I have a very difficult time with ISFPs that are unhealthy. Right? Like ISFPs that are unhealthy, I don't get them at all. And so I don't even know what to do when an ISFP is really unhealthy around me. I feel like they're unpredictable. I know people that feel the exact opposite. I know people who are like, no, I can totally handle an unhealthy ISFP, but an unhealthy ENFP, that's a chaos agent from hell, right? Like that's a terrible person. So we're going to have people that we can work with their neurotic, like if they're really neurotic, we can work with their neurosis a little better than people of other types and the neurosis they tend to bring up. And so just keep that in mind and go, maybe it's that they're unhealthy. That's why I'm taking exception to them. It's the lack of health. That's the thing that I hate. And if I found a healthy version one, it kind of goes back to the whole, like, don't edit out the better examples. If I can find healthy versions of this type and recognize them as such, I don't hate the type. I might have a strong aversion to an unhealthy, person of this personality or individual of this personality type. And I think that we can't get around that. If somebody is unhealthy and we already don't share a lot in common and we already have a bit of a challenge, but we're doing our best and seeing the best in each other. And so we don't hate that person or that personality type. We're just kind of like, we're like kind of making peace with them. And maybe if we just happen to find someone that we share a lot in common with and our impression changes, like me and Uncle Ralph. I love Uncle Ralph, right? Like he's totally changed my opinion of ISTJs. He was one of my early people that I went, he's an ISTJ. Huh. And then Uncle Ralph was like now my on-ramp into loving ISTJs.
Yeah.
We might not have that experience, but we can at least recognize when what we're actually dealing with is a lack of health, not a personality type that represents millions of human beings on the planet. So I think keeping that in mind is really important, that we might be dealing with somebody dealing with a lot of challenges. Not somebody who's just intrinsically challenging.
Okay, to recap, I wrote some notes this time, so my brain doesn't go blank. So the 4 things that we talked about is check in with your own energy. Like if there's a personality type that you hate, check in with your own energy. Am I bringing something to this interaction every time I'm interacting with this personality type? That's a good place to check. The second thing is what could this type be triggering in me, unprocessed material, maybe shadow material, maybe not just shadow functions, but shadow material, things I don't want to accept or see about myself. What is this maybe bringing up in me? So that's another thing to check. Like, is there a trigger opportunity to go deeper into something I'm dealing with? The third thing that we mentioned was going into a meta perspective, seeing why I'm grateful for this personality type to exist in the ecosystem and the functions they carry. Why do all these need to exist in our humanity? What do they bring to the table? If I can create some understanding and some gratitude, well, that'll soften me toward this personality type. And then the fourth thing you talked about, or we talked about, was checking in with the health levels. Like, how healthy is this person? Maybe this isn't a very healthy person in general, and they're carrying their personality type with them. So I've conflated lack of health as a person with this personality type. But all I'm seeing is an unhealthy version of this personality type, not necessarily a type I don't get along with or I hate. So I think those are some key things to think in terms of as we go through our lives, and we have people that, hate's a strong word, but there's people we hate. Let's just say it that way. There's people we hate that represent a type. We start to get a pattern. We start to hate that type. And it's probably not making us feel very good. So I think that's why we want to talk about it, is people don't like hating a personality type. It's not fun. It's all this foreboding. Almost always when somebody says they hate a personality type, like, I hate personality type, and then before they even finish it, I assume they're going to say ENTJ. I don't know why. I love ENTJs, but I've heard a lot of people like bitch about ENTJs. I don't know why. I think because a lot of bosses end up being ENTJs, like people that are in charge of you, because they rise to the top often in dominance hierarchies.
Or ESTJs.
Yeah. But like for some reason, ENTJs even more so than ESTJs. I don't know why. I just hear a lot. Maybe it's just in our world. Anyway, the point is, and I think for some reason in our ecosystem too, we attract a lot of strong-willed, intense ENTJs. I love it. I think it's fantastic. They don't bother me a bit, but man, do they rub other people the wrong way to the point of like, I hate this personality type. So that always comes up in my mind. So I just kind of have like this, it's almost like a little caricature of a person that doesn't get along with the ENTJ, that feels like overridden by them. And I kind of take that little model and I figure that's how everybody's relationship is with everybody's type, but that's not it at all. Like, again, your issue or your hatred is going to be just as unique as that, what you talked about, the anachronic, the quote, it's going to be unique to you, which type you hate and how you hate them.
Well, and I thought you were going to say it. So I wasn't expecting you to say it's always the ENTJs.
Oh,
but I was, I thought it was going to be, there's almost always a role that follows my ENTJ boss.
Well,
right?
Yeah. And maybe I'm just not thinking like enough examples, but that's just like, I can't get that one out of my head. So many people bitch about ENTJs in my world. I'm like, good Lord, people.
Right. But I mean, like, what I'm saying is that I thought you were going to say there's always a role associated.
Yeah.
Meaning that like it's, and
it seems to be a pattern.
And the role is that's the important thing.
Yes.
It's my boss. I hate my boss, but then now type. And so now you're saying I hate my ENTJ boss.
Yeah.
Right. And so when there's a role that is challenging, I think that's another thing to keep in mind. It's like my mother-in-law. Okay, well, that's a challenging role.
Yes.
Or my boss, or my ex, or make sure that you're keeping in mind the challenging role as well. The person might not be unhealthy. They might just be in a role
they're just doing their job.
They're just doing their thing,
just hate their job.
That's right. And that's actually what's going on.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I think there's actually a lot of different reasons why we might end up with some of these biases. And the antidote to a bias is always to question the premise. Always question the premise.
Yeah.
So if you've got somebody in your life, a personality type, an individual that's representing this personality type, and you quote unquote hate them, remember that you're bringing something in that you probably are not really doing much reevaluating around.
Yes.
And because of that, the bias has its own energy. It's almost like the bias has its own intent that it's traveling with.
Yeah.
And so you have to keep that in mind.
I think I know why I was bringing that up. I think it's cultural. It's socially conditioned.
Mm-hmm.
Like how many people, the reason I brought that up, because I was like, yeah, why did I bring that up? The thought was, I don't hear, and I haven't really heard, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody, I hate INFJs. Like, I hate INFJs. Like, you don't hear that.
Or ISFJs.
Or ISFJs.
Yeah.
And it tells me that there's a social, cultural, it's okay to hate ENTJs, for example, and bitch about your ENTJ boss, right? Like, it's socially okay if you know type.
Yeah.
Like, we're allowed in type land, if you understand personality types, to hate that specific type, because they're always a challenge, XYZ. But in the counter, it's like, but this other type's always beloved no matter who they are.
Yeah.
Right? That's always a love type. So if you're in the personality type world, I think we have conditioning, social conditioning that conditions us, like preconditions us to see certain types in certain ways.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's the reason why I was bringing it up. But I think your addition to it as well of the role.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that, but that's actually very useful to bring that into the equation as well.
Yeah. In fact, there's almost like there's a little bit of a moat around INFJs, right? There's some protective layers.
The only people who can get through are narcissists. They know how to swim across moats, but everybody else can't get through.
That's right. INFJs and their
like,
narcissists.
all these narcissists, I can't keep the moat big enough to keep them out.
They can't get them out. But that said, there's even been like kind of a gatekeeping around INFJs. It's like if you say you're an INFJ and you're not, then expect to have a bunch of memes sent your direction about how you're like a fake INFJ. And so there is a little bit of protectiveness, and that makes sense because I would say everybody who is into type, or like at least for a long time, it seemed like they were all INFJs.
Yeah,
they weren't. But I would say also INFJs in and of themselves are seeking type content at a disproportionately high level because they are very frequently, they're on this almost like the uncanny valley of being able to blend in with society seamlessly while at the same time trying to figure out why they don't belong in any of the places that believe they belong.
Yeah.
I think that's actually the reason why INFJs are so attracted to type. Like, it's like they're the ones who can seamlessly integrate into a baby shower while the entire time wishing they were anywhere but a baby shower. And so that creates a lot of what is wrong with me? What is going on? And the second they understand type preferences, particularly introverted intuition, all of a sudden everything becomes clear and they become very loyal to this tool that helped explain that.
Yeah.
Whereas there's other types that are more weird than INFJs, but they're not seamlessly blending into society. So they don't need an explanation for why they have this disconnect, this thing that can't be reconciled. They're like, I'm just a weirdo. And then they learn type and they're like, oh, that's why I'm a weirdo. Okay. And sometimes that's really helpful and sometimes they don't care that much.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably why INFJs are so attracted to it. And then there ends up being some gatekeeping and ends up being some moats around it and all that stuff. I don't want to throw INFJs under a bus at all because my mom has INFJ preferences as well and is a person who I grew up being very close to. And every INFJ I've ever known, I've gotten along with for the most part. So not to go like, they're a protected class, but there's a little bit of protection that happens in type communities socially and culturally. And there are other types that are less protected. Like you said, it's totally okay to talk about ESTJs in a very negative way. It's like, okay, so then that must be that they're bad people. And so we talk crap about them. But it's like, no, it's just usually comes along with the word boss or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that also needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah. So we want to hear from you. What's coming up for you as you've been listening along, watching this? Are you identifying with this? Do you have a personality type you hate or multiples you hate? Come over, let us know. I'd like to hear that.
Or hate how they make you feel, if you want to say it in the more diplomatic way.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to say it. But, we don't necessarily always represent the most healthy way to see anything. We just sometimes we have our experience of what it is. So is there a type you hate? Have you overcome it? Do you still hate this type? Is this a challenging type for you? What are you doing about it? You just written them off? Do you try to avoid them? Like, what's your story? I'd like to know how you deal with it. Let's say you do have a type you hate. Fill in the 4 letters. Okay, how do you get past it for yourself? And do the 4 recommendations we gave give you some material to work with? Like maybe go and try this out. I'd love to see what you try out and come back and report to us what works, what doesn't work, how this works for you. So come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode, ask a question, leave a comment, or share your story about the types that you hate or don't hate and your relationship to that.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed the podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all sorts of places so that you can be notified of the next episode. And if you're watching us on YouTube, which you might be doing right now, watching the video podcast, you can subscribe, and hit the little bell. It lets you know when a new episode comes out on that as well. We have owner's manuals that are designed for all 16 types. And they are intended to be a deep dive into your cognition so that you will understand how to navigate this experience, this crazy thing called life, in the best way possible, having your type preferences work for you as opposed to against you. So get yourself a copy of Your Personality Type's Owner's Manual. We can't recommend it highly enough.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.